obvious candidates: China, Macau, Hong Kong, Taiwan, Singapore as a predominantly Sinic enclave, and sort of South Korea and Japan. And I'll justify that in a moment. You can trace a lot of the core values and core orientations that are now making East Asian higher education so successful from its civilizational origins. The strong state, comprehensive state of the Han period, and then the extension of the influence of Sinic civilization to Korea and Japan. Korea, then Japan, Japan through Korea. And it's striking how in traditional Japanese culture, which is so well preserved in Kyoto and other places, you can see recognisable Tang cultural motives. And it's, in many respects, Japan, Korea and China are quite different places now. Politically, yes, but also in other ways too. But the influence of Tang and then Neo-Confucian ideas in Japan and Korea is very striking. What are the features that underpin the rise of East Asia? Well, I think the role of the state is less subject to constant questioning than it is in the American and English language polities. Anti-statism is not built into the political fabric, this sort of notion of the limited state and the standoff between the market as the realm of freedom or the civil society and the state, on the other hand. It's not really part of the conceptual apparatus of the political cultures of East Asia. There's more support for the mission of the state, which is to provide prosperity and order, and to take responsibility for a broader range of things than, including innovation, education, research and so on, than in some countries outside the region. On the other hand, the state doesn't take responsibility for some things which are in the domain of the family, but are in the domain of the state in other jurisdictions, like aspects of welfare and aged care. So it does vary, but in the area of education and research and science, the state is right in the middle of the picture, regardless of whether it's private sector or public sector, regardless of whether it's privately funded or publicly funded. And of course, the dynamic of Confucian self-cultivation in the home. The core values of education are part of life from the beginning in a way which doesn't occur anywhere else in the world, and this creates a profound educated capacity in the population. Even very poor families will put all of their extra money into education. American families might spend a third of their income on housing. A family in China or Korea will spend maybe a third of their income on education. So you have different values. And education more important, more central. And of course the role of examination as a sorting device, as a meritocratic device to a degree. And that of course is where the examination comes from. In this period of modernisation and catch up to the West, modernisation of education systems has been central. Incessant reform and improvement, lifting of professional development standards in schools, and combine that with the incentive to learn at the level of the family, the incentive to use education as a ladder as well, and you have these fantastic PISA results. I think these are well known to everyone. But the top 7 systems in mathematics are all in East Asia and so on, but it's also in reading. It's not just STEM. It's about language as well. And now European levels of participation are all better, with South Korea and Taiwan being amongst the really outstanding systems in terms of near universal or universal participation. Hong Kong and Singapore have now come up to majority level participation. We don't have a number for Singapore because it's a secret, but there's 2 secret systems. There's Canada, which never tells you anything because it doesn't have national agencies, and there's Singapore, which doesn't tell you anything because it doesn't want you to know. And China, well, these are the 2011 figures, well, recent figures for 29% and for 2013. So, and China, we think, will reach its 2020 target of 40%. R&D, European levels of R&D spending, percentage of GDP. I mean, South Korea especially, second highest in the world after Israel. And in Japan continues. Japan has its problems in this period, as we all know, but continues to be a stellar performer in terms of R&D investment and significant innovator in key areas of industry. These are just the OECD figures, and you can pick them up off the web. But I like the way that you see the boutique European economy sort of mirrored in Asia, except the East Asian countries are on a larger scale mostly.
So Russia's an interesting standard.
Oh, we'll talk about that.
Sorry. But really, so have we looked back in sort of 10-year chunks, what the trend line might have been, and I just find that fascinating.
It's an amazing story. I mean, it's a fascinating set of problems, and with no obvious solution in sight. I think that Isaac Fruman would like to join this group and talk to you further about it. But he's aware of the problems as everyone else is, but it doesn't seem to move forward. The number of science papers coming out of Russia has been going down, for about a decade. I mean, they inherited this very strong applied military engineering and physics and related research capacity, which has just eroded. I mean, once the changeover occurred in 1992, the Soviet Union collapsed, then all the salaries in research institutes disappeared, and except in the strongest institutions in the national sense, like Moscow State University and the Academy of Sciences, and even parts of that were affected. All the smaller institutes and either went on the market, went out of research and did other things, or tried to build an applied research and industry agenda. People left in droves. The younger people, especially the talent that was coming through in the late 80s, early 90s, left much of it. There's still that capacity in physics. I mean, there's areas where applied physics, but more theoretical physics, nuclear, where there's still really good people in Russia, but nothing like what it was. So
are there any political signs that they might try and change?
They talk about world-class universities. They've got a world-class university program, 5 in the top 100. It's totally unachievable on their present conditions and settings. It's like Malaysia was about 20 years ago. It's all rhetoric and no substance.
Sure.
I mean, Malaysia did get there, so you can get out of that state. I don't know about Russia, and there's much larger issues there. I mean, the swing to a resource-based sort of, and rent-based economy has been, obviously part of the problem. The sort of de-intellectualisation that's occurred. Russia still does very well on some tests at school level of mathematical capacity and produces lots of great test players, but you can't help feeling that there's something very strong in the culture which isn't coming through in the education system or in the university science performance, but the science figures are dismal. I interviewed there a lot in 2013, and I went to one engineering university where, which was obviously had very good people, but they were all doing research in Russian for applied purposes for the metallurgy industry. Not much of it was being published, a lot of it was being circulated. They had a kind of scientific community. And I think that's how they used to operate in Soviet time. They did everything in Russian, they didn't put anything outside to the outside world because that was strategically a bad idea as they saw it. And they've still got this idea. And I had a discussion with someone from the consulate here in London about this very issue. They still believe that they should take in the research from everyone else, turn it into Russian, but they shouldn't put their own research out there because then they'll give others an advantage. They still believe that. They don't understand that connecting to the rest of the world is how you actually function in this environment, otherwise you can't function effectively. They don't understand internationalisation. And the thing that China and Singapore have understand so well, about the need to internationalise to be able to catch up and compete. That Russia's just outside that framework, just can't think it through. I don't know what it is, but you see it also in Japan. You see it there as well. This kind of national boundedness, but it's worse in Russia.
So, Simon, just before you move on, is that just public investment, or does that include
That's a whole lot, except Switzerland figure doesn't have private investment because they don't have the number. The others have all got public and private.
So it's quite high for places like Germany and Denmark, where it's almost entirely public.
Yeah, basically. Although in Germany there's a bit of industry investment as well, because strong high quality manufacturing, does sustain some R&D. The ratios really vary. Like the role of universities really varies. For example, in the UK it's almost 30% university funding. In China it's 8%. Most of it's in the state enterprises. Although they do work, though the universities do work for them. So some of the university work shows up in the state enterprise income figures. In the US, 16 to 18% in the universities. In Australia, it's about the same. So it does vary, and these figures have got very different meanings in terms of industry R&D, especially. And of course, what industry R&D is also a problem because you have the Australian situation, which inch up as chief scientist, always used to say, I don't believe the R&D figures because it's all just a tax lurk, really. It's just this claim about taxation, you know, people putting all kinds of costs onto that and calling it R&D, so you don't really know, but those factors vary by nation, and that's the problem with standardised figures, but you know, you need to break this down further to get a real picture of what it does, but I think the aggregate matters because it tells you about the size of the R&D labour force, probably gives you a hint about, correlates fairly closely with publication output, and it correlates fairly closely with public investment as well. So. As the inputs increase, the outputs increase, and the basic science in China has just gone up like a rocket. 16% rate of increase in research papers, new research papers coming out. That's quantity, not quality of research, but it's a pretty important figure. Although you can't see it clearly because these numbers are lower and so the slope appears less, South Korea, Taiwan and Singapore, the rate of growth is again rapid. Not as rapid as China, but still rapid. The thing that's really interesting, I think, about East Asia is the quality improvement. And this has all happened in the last 15 years. In the case of China, take chemistry for example, probably China's strongest major discipline, although computing research is even stronger than chemistry. In the year 2000, China published 3.7% of the world's papers in chemistry. In the year 2012, 12 years later, it was jumped to 16.9. But what's more important is that the share of top 1% papers, top 1% by citation, has gone up from 0.6, which is a small figure, to 16.3. I mean, it's a rate of, it's almost unimaginable rate of increase. And there's an aggregate effect across the whole system.
Simon, so is that partly self-sustaining? Because
self-citation?
you grows Chinese chemists cite other Chinese chemists.
Yes, I think national systems, the US and China, do have a kind of system engine effect, yes. In all citation data, that it helps. It also helps to explain why both the US and China don't have the foreign collaboration figures, don't have the co-authorship figures that some other countries do, because they have so many internal collaborators to collaborate with. Those factors do play a role, but that rate of increase, of course, can't be explained easily like that. It's clearly a rate of increase in good science. Now, similar things happen though, and maybe this is also underlines my point in response to Chris's question. If you look at Korea and Taiwan and Singapore are part of the a sort of other Asia group in these same data, and the rate of increase is not much less than the rate of increase in top papers in China. So Singapore, Korea and Taiwan as a group are also improving their top 1% and their top 10% papers at a very rapid rate. So there is something happening in terms of quality improvement in East Asia. And other systems will be well advised, I think, to look at it. This is these are some numbers for some of the stellar research universities in the region. And you can see in the last column the growth in the number of top 10% papers in the Leiden ranking over 5 years. Nanyang is the big emerging star. It's not far below NUS in some indicators. In fact, its citation rate, its percentage of papers with high cites is slightly higher than at NUS. It's still not as big as NUS. And I wouldn't say it's as strong in terms of international strategy, for example, but it's certainly had a phenomenal improvement. Tsinghua is certainly a very successful university because it's very large, like some of the others, like Zhejiang, but it's also got high citation rates as well. China has two kinds of research university. It's got the very large ones, like Shanghai Jiaotong and Tsinghua and Zhejiang, with very strong sciences and engineering and so on. And it also has a group of medium-sized S&T players like the Academy University, University of Science and Technology, or Nankai, Jilin and so on. And they've got very good citation rates, but they don't have the volume. But it's good to have more than one kind of leading university in the system, because, and it also has implications for the kinds of partnerships which can be formed as well. So it affects outside non-Chinese universities as well. You can see that Hong Kong's a great system, you know, 5 really strong universities, none of them really big. Balanced system, and the quality across the board is pretty high in my experience. Not growing though, a mature system not growing at the same rate as Singapore. And you could say the same about Seoul National, you know, that it's probably had it's longer to establish itself. But interesting to see the comparison with MIT and Cambridge. MIT and Cambridge are increasing their number of high citation papers too, But they're mature institutions, obviously, they're well established, they're not growing at these phenomenal rates. Now, this is interesting. I just did these numbers last night. The US National Science Foundation uses the Web of Science data from Thomson Reuters to measure collaboration, co-authorship across international borders. And these figures can establish these figures measure the comparative intensity of the collaboration relationship. The first figure looks at all of these countries are partnering China, and these numbers are measuring the intensity of the partnership with China as measured by co-authorship. Singapore 2.2, that's a very high collaboration rate. The collaboration rate is established by comparing the normal pattern of collaboration in country A and the normal pattern of country B in country B, establishing what would be the expected figure, making that 1.00, and then if the collaboration rate is twice as great, that means that there's twice as much activity going on, twice as much co-authorship going on as you would expect given the overall collaboration patterns of both countries. So if one of the partners has got normally low collaboration rates, you can get rather inflated figures, but generally speaking in the larger countries these are meaningful figures. The point I want to make here is that only Singapore, Taiwan, Japan, Australia and the United States have collaboration with China higher than you would expect given the collaboration patterns of both countries in each partnership. That means people are not working with China as much as you'd expect, and that is partly because of the effect that Chris pointed to. Large system, people collaborate with each other, and so on. So countries that are above the 1.00 line here are significant players in China. And most countries are below that 1.00 level. You would say that's probably an unmet opportunity for some countries. When we go to Korea though, with its 50 million people, smaller country, like a medium to large European country, but not like China, much more cross-border work. And what's really interesting is the way India and Korea have a special relationship in research. Something that's been showing up for a while in both countries. Korea and Japan, Korea and Taiwan, very regional. But there's also some other cases. Egypt doesn't have much collaboration, but what it does have, it has a lot with Korea. Russia too. Russia's not co-publishing much, but Korea's an important player in its co-publication. And the United States relationship is traditionally always there in Korea, in research. So, but you've got the whole of the first column are countries that are collaborating above the expected level. So more engagement with Korea. But some interesting exceptions, like Australia's got a low level of engagement, Canada's got a low level of engagement. Now, let's move to try and put some qualitative analysis into this whole largely quantitative picture. I've said there are three major trends. The growth of participation towards high participation systems in almost every country. The growth and spread of scientific capacity and the emergence of the movement for world-class universities and the spread of policies favouring world-class universities and to some extent achieving world-class universities in a much larger number of countries, and the rise of East Asia. I could have had a section on the rise of Latin America. It would have been less dramatic, although Brazil has seen some major growth in research and science, especially outside the universities actually. And Argentina and Mexico are not really progressing very fast, but Chile is doing well, and Venezuela and Colombia are clearly next kids on the block. But it's a more muted story compared to the East Asian story. I could also have talked about Saudi Arabia, perhaps the Middle East and North Africa more generally, where there's clearly a lot of government-fed, and the Gulf, of course, a lot of government-fed activity in research and science, especially in the Saudi Arabia. But less spectacular than the East Asian story. But what we're seeing is, in some respects, a worldwide evening up. Latin America, 4 decades of political peace and economic growth. East Asia now as rich as Europe, as you can see from the figures, except for Vietnam. Eastern China is certainly at European levels already. Beijing and so on. region as well. And to some extent, I suppose, the Middle East, where the power of money, does count. So you're seeing some evenness, if you like. You're seeing the Gini coefficient at the world level is because it's impossibly wide, because it spans wealthy countries and countries with GDP per head of less than $200 US. But it is narrowing the worldwide Gini coefficient. So you are seeing a kind of trend to worldwide equalisation between countries. That's a very macro, broad trend, and there are exceptions, but that's the overall pattern. And of course, in the case of East Asia, catch-up is real. I mean, if you could look at the way the level of number of scientific papers in the US is the grey background, the red bars coming up are China and the rest of East Asia, and see how the bars are now meeting the grey background. And in fact, if we took the figures forward to 2015, there's no doubt the East Asian numbers will be higher. In fact, China will produce more papers than the US on present trends within the decade, and probably shorter, like 5 or 6 years, I would think. And, world-class universities is just East Asia, but you could do this for Saudi Arabia, where it's created world-class universities out of nothing. And there are more in Latin America, there are more in the Arab countries than there were. But in China, big growth in the number of world-class universities. That should be 2015, sorry, 2014. And Taiwan as well. And in Europe too. I think it's been the competitive pressure that the ARWU ranking and other things have generated. Certainly the Lisbon strategy was about global competitiveness of Europe, and science and technology are at the heart of that. And you do see now more European universities in the top 100 on all the measures, with the Swiss doing particularly well and the Dutch continuing to run a pretty strong system. The UK is not included in these numbers. The UK holds its ground in the top 10 universities at least. There are some more doubts further down. But this greater equalisation, this greater plurality of global knowledge power, if you like, with much larger number of countries with high participation in education, much larger number of countries with scientific capacity, this pluralisation is occurring at the same time as the trend to greater income inequality as measured by Gini coefficients and similar measures in more than 2/3 of countries. Not all countries. Latin America, which was the most unequal region on the Gini coefficient figures historically, is almost uniformly seeing with the modernisation process and with the more effective states than there were in terms of transfers and so on, taxation systems, it is seeing a reduction in the Gini coefficient. So that, and Brazil being the most notable example, and OECD has been theorising that it's due to education that this reduction is occurring in Brazil, but I'm not so sure. But that's not the dominant pattern worldwide. In East Asia, on Gini coefficient figures, the modernisation process again is associated on the whole with a reduction in inequality, certainly in the case of Korea, Taiwan. And Japan continues to maintain a medium level of inequality rather than high inequality. China, it's more complicated by the rural-urban divide drives continuing inequality. But the movement of the growth of the middle class means that the tendency for stratification in the society is offset by this huge absolute growth in the number of opportunities to rise up. So at the moment, even if the Gini figures are not showing it, China is becoming more equal in that social sense. But that's not the dominant pattern. And the dominant pattern in the English-speaking world, Western Europe to a lesser extent, is increasing inequality on all measures. Of course, the famous example, the one that probably matters the most in terms of driving overall trends, is the United States. In the period before World War I, the top 1% in Europe, the old Europe, aristocratic Europe, still quasi-aristocratic Europe, took 20% of total income. That's very high. The figure now is more like 10% in Europe, despite increased inequality in the last 20 years. In the Nordic countries at one point it got down to 7, that's very low. In fact, in some countries it was down to 5. But in the United States now, and all of the changes occurred since 1980, since the Reagan years, since the Reagan tax tax cuts to 28% on the top marginal rate, and the breaking of the air traffic controller strike, and then the deunionisation of wage setting in many workplaces. The United States, the top 1%, is now taking 20% again. So that's higher than it's ever taken in the United States in recorded history. And it's back to the level of old Europe, old aristocratic Europe. The lower 50% likewise has had its share emptied out. Piketty says that by 2030, the figure will be more like 25% for the top 1%, and the lower 50% will be taking 15% of the total take, compared to its 30% high point in the Scandinavian 1970s. So growing inequality, the data are unambiguous.
I'm sorry, I hope you don't mind.
Yeah.
You did invite interruptions.
Yeah, of course.
I'm just interested in the Nordic countries.
Yeah.
We're at 7% and 30%, and I'm just interested that's classified as low inequality because that's
It's low.
It is low inequality, but
Yeah.
it's still a hell of a gap, isn't it?
Yeah. It's low by historic standards, by the nature of society.
7%.
There's still a social
I
elite.
would have expected less in the top.
It was
sector.
5% in Sweden at one stage.
Yeah.
A bit higher in Finland, a bit higher in Denmark and Norway.
So just an interesting observation of what is regarded as low, given that it's not very
Yes.
deep.
It's not 1%. No. I mean, in Australia it got right down at one point, well below 10%. Like it was sort of the 7 or 8 or 9, round about there in the 70s.
In Australia now?
Australia and Canada have followed the US trend, but not as much. And Australia is now around about 12 to 15, and Canada's slightly higher. Although Canada's got more mobility, which is interesting than Australia has. The UK's followed the US more closely, and the UK is the second most unequal in terms of trends. There's no doubt about the data. Atkinson, Piketty and Sayers have pumped out papers for 20 years, and they've pretty well got cornered the market on the data. And while there's issues about interpretation, of course, there's not much doubt about the objectivity of the material. The income inequality historically was driven by wealth, was driven by property and financial holdings. Now, in the United States, it's predominantly been driven by high salaries for managers, super managers. We seem to have missed out on that to a large extent in the education sector. But our manager salaries are only, I'm afraid, a very weak echo of what's happening in the finance sector. Finance is the major player here, and finance has more than twice its share of high salaries as to what its share of economic activity overall would suggest. And of course, as you know, the very top, the salaries are very high, like in the many millions. So that's this generation. In the next generation, those salaries get passed on to children, and they become inherited wealth. They become property income, and we go back to a more traditional pattern. But in this period, high inequality and growing inequality has been driven in a more quasi-meritocratic fashion by what people do at work, the risks they take, the burdens they carry at work. But of course, people set their own salaries at that level. So the issue about merit is probably not fully decided. Now I just wanted to give you that backdrop about increasing inequality because it helps explain some of the other things that have been going on. Let's now swing to higher education. A group of us, of which Glenn is part of the group, are working on a project which we call high participation systems, and one of the areas we've been looking at is stratification. And without taking you through the full theorisation, we've tentatively concluded that, and this is not unheard of, I mean it's just following, I suppose, a Bourdieuian argument, although we don't use Bourdieuian reasoning, that as you move towards mass and then universal education, the proportion of places in education which offer stellar opportunities shrinks as part of the total number of places. That is, this grows more than that grows in proportional terms. So the competition for this gets more and more intense. And middle-class families are able to deploy all kinds of assets and resources to affect the outcomes of that competition. So over time, you get an increased stratification and more vertical hierarchy of outcomes. A number of things happen. One is that as you grow, you have a tendency for the stratification of institutions to occur, the other thing that happens is you have a tendency for stratification of opportunities and outcomes to get steeper as well. And this shows up again and again in comparative studies, like the Shabbat et al. Study of stratification in higher education 2007, with its different national case studies. Pretty consistent pattern. I mean, there's some variations, but it was pretty consistent. So we have this paradox that, you know, as you expand total participation, inequality tends to expand, get worse as well, unless states do something